Happy days. Right. 10 o'clock. Let's crack on. So, for those of you that have joined me before, my name's Phil Bennett. We're going to talk about landings today. And this PowerPoint presentation, I'm not just going to read everything off here. Mainly it's all off the cuff and ad-libbed with obviously some element of preparation. But this is just a framework just to keep me broadly as possible to track and to keep things coherent. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, brief introduction about me for those that have never seen me before. Then we're going to talk about what we've talked about a little bit, some of the material in the prior webinars, and we've covered accidents and takeoff so far. Then we're going to look at some recent accidents that have happened, which show why some of what we're talking about is relevant in the real world. And then we're going to move on to talk a little bit about some very basic gyroplane dynamics, which is relevant because some of the things that we talk about, and I'm just going to move Ken back to an attendee. There you go, Ken. Some of it's relevant because very often when people try and sell these machines, in some ways they get oversold and the virtues and qualities are magnified, which unless you can put them in the correct context, it's not ideal. Then we're going to look at what goes wrong with landings. Then we're going to look at airmanship, talk about some techniques. And what I'd like is, while I'm getting to that point, the element of techniques, this bit about techniques, will be added value for you guys if you have some specific parts or things you'd like me to talk about, because obviously then you can relate it to what you are actually doing rather than trying to listen to me and then after the fact apply it to what you're doing. And then we're going to talk about a big hobby horse of mine, which is mental capacity, which is very often overlooked, certainly in the pilot training arena. Okay, so assuming there's no questions for any of you, no, and everyone's up to speed, we will crack on with some common themes of what we've talked about before and things that have happened recently. So if you follow my YouTube channel, you'll know that I've been talking recently about Cavalon accidents, and to put it in context from the data, and if you watch the film after, just to get some wider context, but basically in America, the accident rate for Cavalon, as far as I can see, is around 23%. In the UK, it's about 15 to 16%. I think it's 15 spot something, I can't remember, to the decimal place. The only real difference between what happens over in the States and what happens in the UK is that the training as a lead-in is quite a bit more rigorous, as in, even if you're a very experienced pilot in the UK of something else, so fixed wing or helicopter, you still need to do a minimum, and it is a minimum, it's not a target, 25 hours of training on a gyroplane before you get a gyroplane license. In the States, there's no minimum requirement, and very often existing pilots are getting licenses quite quickly, even when their prior experience isn't actually that relevant. And I'll give you an example. Recently, an aircraft crashed November 635 Bravo Charlie. I found a bit more out about that accident from some of his friends that have emailed me. Turns out, and I'm getting this secondhand from his friends, but I've no reason to doubt the integrity of it, that the guy who crashed that aircraft, he effectively got slow. I think he was out sightseeing somewhere, got slow and pancaked in. He came to gyroplanes from powered parachutes. So I presume that would be a paraglider, as we know in England. I presume it's a consistent term across the world, but from a paraglider. Now in the UK, a paraglider would have you get no credits for being a paraglider pilot. He then got his gyroplane add-on to his sport license in 12 hours, and he'd got 60 hours of total time on gyroplanes when he had his accident. And the reality is, he's a very inexperienced guy, and at some point you don't know what you don't know, and sadly he's probably destroyed, I don't know, best part of $120,000 of aircraft, and he's probably lucky that he could walk away from an aircraft accident. And of course, that kind of thing is a common theme. Certainly we've talked about it before when we've looked at accidents in the accident webinar, and when we looked at the problems that people face during takeoffs. And very often, if we use this graphic as a guide, some of these things that we're doing are unsafe. They're either unintended or they're intended. Very often they're following the path of unintended actions because they're mistakes, lapses or slips, but they're errors that we didn't intend to make. It wasn't the fact that we set out to go flying to deceive the rules or to be dangerous or to violate regulations, as is depicted on this graphic, but we just make mistakes. And clearly, if you look at the top of the right-hand side, the attentional failures, that can come by the fact that you're overloaded mentally. It can clearly come from the fact that you weren't trained enough or with enough rigor. And again, that's the kind of thing that snags you, and doesn't necessarily snag you during the training phase. Why? Because you're in a training environment where often, for example, if you take a training environment where we do the briefing and say, okay, today we're going to practice emergency landings with, with glide approaches. Naturally, having sat through a briefing of half an hour from an instructor and then gone through a demo, and you're in an environment and an area where you're flying which is conducive to that action, it's no surprise that during the training environment, if you have an engine failure, 90% of the time you pull off the best forced landing ever. Whereas if it happens for real, there's a lot more emotion. Typically, you're not over the ideal, terrain, and it's a shock. Adrenaline's pumping, and now you've got to remember it, having not already had a demo from an instructor that was obviously pretty good, and a half-hour briefing as a lead-in. So that's the thing. You may, if you're an avid follower of the YouTube channel, back in May 16, I made this little film. It was because the timing of that film was really, I suppose, driven a lot because in the UK, during this coronavirus thing, which is still ongoing for all of us, I guess, but aviation, general aviation was banned. You couldn't do it in the UK until the middle of May. And then in the middle of May, our civil aviation authority suggested you could go flying. Now, it was clear to me that given our winter in the UK is from effectively November through to February, there's not, you can't fly consistently during those months. And then the virus came in March, and then we're in lockdown. So very often, pilots were going to go back to flying in May, having probably not flown since maybe October of the previous year. So I made that film, and one of the things that's very interesting, and it wasn't a controversial film, but if you look down here, look, 34 likes, 27 thumbs down, and guess what happens? Made that film May 16, May 27th, you know, this guy's destroyed Golf, Tango, Yankee, Romeo, Oscar. And we'll look at the report a little bit later. But basically, he's returned to flight. He's done a couple of circuits, and then he's crashed on the return to the airfield. And as you can see here, you know, he's done 3 hours, which is probably the 3 hours he was flying during that day before he crashed, and then 1 extra hour in the other 2 months. So, you know, why people don't pay attention. This is a particularly good thing to follow. It actually comes from the gliding world. The British Gliding Association produced this. And essentially what they do is they're saying, look, you've either got hours or you've got launches. So for us, we can take that as takeoffs or landings. And, you know, you draw a line between the number of hours you've flown and the number of takeoffs and landings you've done, and you're either in the green or you're in the red. The other thing is over here, if you haven't flown in the previous 90 days, they suggest that you get a check flight with an instructor. And I don't think that's a bad, you know, at least to stick in the sand. And especially, look, at the end of the day, some of you watching this may have, you know, multiple thousands of hours and fly certainly weekly. But often people are watching these things either having only just got their license, or they're in the process of getting their license, or they're thinking about getting their license. And they may think that gyroplanes are some crazy death trap. They're not, but you've just got to be sensible. Right, so I've got all that done. I've got something in the chat. What's in my chat? Yes, indeed. So, any questions from any of that? I presume not. If not, and no questions on that. Right, good. Okay, so let's move on. Now, we probably are all aware that the principal design feature that Joan de la Sierra was after with his gyroplane when he invented them was that it was an aircraft that couldn't stall. And that's correct, they can't stall, but what they do is when you get slow, rather than stalling the wing and spinning in, you generate a sink rate. We'll talk about why in a minute, but fundamentally, the gyroplane or the gyrocopter stays airborne through a combination of airspeed, as you can read on the airspeed indicator, rotor RPMs, and angle of attack, which for our purposes, we can take as the stick position. Now, clearly, we're talking about landings today, not takeoffs. So the rotor RPM is broadly a constant. Some people try and blur that, and again, I'll talk about that later. But basically, rotor RPMs are broadly constant. So the only thing that we're changing to keep this aircraft in the air is whatever speed we can read from the airspeed indicator and the angle of attack that we're suggesting is the stick position. So if I'm sideways, more angle of attack, less angle of attack probably makes sense. A lot of you, especially if you're from the States, will hear this term, the power curve. I don't like that term. I do know what people mean when they say it, but I don't like it. The reason is people use the word power curve, but they use the word behind the power curve when they say it. And they also use this graphic. This graphic, I think, is a development from something that was in a Benson manual or maybe even one of the Benson magazines years ago. And I don't see how you can be behind that curve very easily. And the problem with the word power curve is a lot of people come to aviation and they know a lot more about automotive things, and they think of a power curve as kind of this, you know, engine RPM and power. And obviously, you know, you can make the engine, and typically when we're flying, we set an engine RPM, and therefore the power doesn't change. So being behind that power doesn't make a lot of sense. What I think they mean is, and what they actually do mean, is they mean being behind the drag curve. In a gyroplane, there's 3 drags. I'm not going to go into all that in great detail. You can take the presentation or review this webinar later in your own time. But basically, you've got parasitic drag, profile drag, and induced drag. Parasitic drag is basically the body of the aircraft being stuffed through the air, creates drag. Profile drag is the drag from the rotor as the rotor spins, and induced drag is the drag that comes through the production of lift. And if you were to visualize that in a smoke chamber, it's those tip vortices basically that come off the end of the rotor or the end of the wing if it's a fixed wing. If you graph all of that, you get parasitic drag and profile drag that increase with speed, and induced drag that decreases with airspeed. And that's because obviously induced drag, as you get faster, because of the way that the lift equation works with velocity squared, if you keep lift constant, then clearly you can take away angle of attack, and therefore the drag reduces. If you add all those drags together, you get total drag, which is the red curve, and then we get this, which then really explains the behind the power curve behind the drag curve. So if you take this blue line here, which is the minimum power required for level flight, which is the bottom of the drag curve, if you go towards 100 knots indicated airspeed, you need more power for increased airspeed. But if you go slower, you need more power for decreasing airspeed. And the reason for that is because if we go back to our total drag curve, there's our minimum power point, and the extra power to go faster is predominantly overcoming the parasitic drag element, and the more power to go more slowly is trying to overcome the increase in the induced drag, because to fly slowly as v squared, as we come down the back side of that slope, then we need more angle of attack. And if we look at this graph, which is angle of attack versus drag, so now we can see that when we add more and more angle of attack, this orange line, coefficient of drag, is now starting to get chunky. Now that's relevant to us with landings, because what tends to happen is once we're in the final part of the landing phase, if you imagine, you can see my telephone. So we're going this way, we're going this way. As you start to flare to land, clearly you're adding more and more angle of attack to try and maintain the aircraft in the air. And in the end, it just runs out of energy and it lands. The reason I mention that is because when we come on to look at what goes wrong with landings, as we will in a minute, depending on how you decide to present the aircraft to the runway, depends on when that critical phase happens. And one of the problems with landings that we find is that a lot of people get very, very slow, and if they're unpracticed, then they get slow, but they also get high and slow, and then they just fall out of the air from the last, 4 or 5 feet. So before I move on to talk about the danger area in landings, any questions from that? No? Good. Okay, perfect. We're all on the same page. Right, okay. Landings, a big danger area. Now, there's no way to sugarcoat some of this, really. And that's to say that that's an accident that happened to an American Ranger gyroplane in Florida. Unsurprisingly, the pilot died. I actually think what happened there was it was a downwind turn, sort of a curving turn to final. And I think he got into a spiral dive. And the problem, if you allow the nose to drop as you turn, but you keep pulling more and more backstick, thinking that you're going to level the aircraft, you don't. All that happens is you tighten the spiral. So if you imagine you start with a wide spiral, if you haven't got very much backstick, but now the nose is dropped, you won't pull out. You don't pull out of the descent by pulling backstick. All you do is tighten the spiral, and eventually you hit the ground. It's kind of a fixed wing thing that gets trained, but I'm not entirely sure how much of that gets trained in the States. Certainly, if you look, it's November 14968. In actual fact, I want to show you something, because if you're a student, I'm just going to be chatting. So if I get distracted, it's just because I'm just trying to look something up for you, because if you're a student and you see this from your instructor, then you need to basically change instructors. Right. So let me just stop the share here and share a different screen. Sorry, this is a bit disjointed actually, but it just came to me. So can you see, you can see this, can't you? Perfect. So this is the NTSB docket management system that goes with the accident that you've just seen. And as you can see here, the title of this bit is Flight Instructors Records. Now, I'm not sure what, kind of records you guys get used to. Just make sure that you can see what I'm looking at here. So basically, all he's done, he's just got a calendar. So he's got some bit of old gash calendar there. And he's just put some hours that people are flying. And in fact, obviously here, look, it suggests that he ran out of a paper calendar and then he moved on to some electronic thing. And I mean, I don't know, I suppose in some ways a little bit, let's go back to the presentation. You know, look, in some ways, I don't know whether there were more substantial records to the guy's training and whether, you know, he was having generally good landings or he had problems during his landings. But if ever you ask for your if you ever ask your instructor for the training records and there's none, or it's just, you know, we did a couple of hours on Sunday the 18th or whatever happens to be, you need to change. You know, there should be paragraphs of information detailing the flight, and obviously anything that you did particularly well or anything that you were particularly struggling with, so that that can form part of the ongoing training. And that, if we go back to what we were saying, about these common problems, and in particular the problems that are happening with Cavalon, if you take the guy that crashed 635 Bravo Charlie and he's only done 12 hours of pilot training, well, there's just a limit to how much stuff you can get done in 12 hours. At the end of the day, bearing in mind that's not necessarily 12 hours of intense training, because normally when you go flying with a student, it probably, in a 1 hour flight, probably 20 minutes is transiting somewhere. You're just doing a general takeoff and getting out to somewhere to do some, maneuvering. So yeah, it staggers me. Anyway, so sadly that was one landing accident. Here's one from Sweden, an MTO3. Would you believe he rounded out? So that means from the descent, so you're descending on final approach, and then you've got the round out, a float, and then a flare. So that round out, he ended up being 7 meters high still above his target landing area, and then fell out of the sky from 7 meters. We've got a question, I think, here. Let's have a look at Q&A. No, they don't, James. So James, I don't know whether you can't see these questions, I doubt. James is asking a question. Do gyros have any kind of warning, either rotor speed or airspeed? No, they don't. So rotor speed, unlike a helicopter, which may have a warning horn, broadly they don't have a rotor speed warning because the rotor is always in auto rotation. The rotor speed is now really just a function of weight. So if you fly a gyroplane straight and level, any of the modern ones, so Magni or Auto Gyro, typically with a normal 2-person load, they'll probably stabilize about 370, 380 rotor RPM. The new MTO Sport, the rotor speeds tend to be a little bit more, around 400. But then they stabilize. The only way you'll get them higher than that is if you roll and pull some G, which has the effect of increasing the weight, if you like, and that creates a higher rotor speed. And there's no warning for airspeed because, quite frankly, because they don't stall, and if you have some basic flying ability, you can utilize the full range of airspeed. So, you can fly, let's say you're at 1,000 feet, you can cut the power and do a vertical descent at 0 airspeed, and that's not a problem so long as that obviously you're cognizant and you're monitoring the instruments. So no, they don't have a warning device, and I don't ever see them having one, to be honest. So that was our friend in Sweden. He crashed, and then just to show that we Brits can smash them up just as well as anybody else. And it's not all about autogyro. Magnis also have accidents. Here, the yellow MTO3, that had a landing accident where he got slow and he felt that there was a gust of wind. The old magical gust of wind blew him over, and the white gyroplane, the Magni, was the result of a student doing circuits. And we'll talk a little bit about the dangers of that in a minute. So, no more questions. So what goes wrong? Well, typically, gyroplanes tend to crash on landing or have issues during the landing phase for these reasons. Either because we've got an inconsistent approach. And what do I mean by inconsistent approach? Well, what I mean is that our pilot is either flying an airspeed that is vastly different or positional wise different every time he comes in to do a landing. And if you want to see a great example of that, you should go to the YouTube channel and look at one of my landing videos. I have got some videos I want to show you. I didn't plan to show you this one, but it's the one that's got about 170,000 views. I'll send a link if anyone struggles to find it, just email me and I'll tell you where it is. But basically, it's a German guy. He's flying a Magni M24, and his approaches are so inconsistent that when he arrives at the point that he needs to do something, so he's flying his final approach, what happens is you come from final approach in the descent, then you've got to stop the aircraft descending by introducing some backstick. That flattening area is called the round out. Then you typically float down the runway an amount of distance, and then you are increasing the amount of backstick, which then flares the aircraft, and then eventually it runs out of energy and touches down. Now, his round out was never consistent because he was arriving at that point with different energy states all of the time, because either if this hand is the point that I'm going to actually aim to do my round out, he was starting his descent from sometimes over here, sometimes a bit closer, and sometimes somewhere in the middle, but also at different heights. So obviously, if you're very high and very close, you can almost cut the power to idle and steam in, and you've got some energy. But if you're far out and quite low, then you've got to kind of drag it into the point there you want to touch down. So he was always very inconsistent, and that didn't give him the best chance to make repetitive decisions and actions at the critical point. So that was part of his problem. One of the problems that led to that was that his instructor had never told him, and this I find incredible, his instructor had never told him to trim the aircraft on final approach. So he was always hand flying it, which is very difficult to do. So that's one problem. The other is slow and/or glide approaches. Then we have aggressive flares, so i.e. the point where we're trying to get the aircraft to stop is very aggressive. We're almost standing it on its nose. It's almost, if you look at it from the side, it's almost like a horse rearing up onto its back legs. And the problem, well, we'll talk about what the problem and the functions of all those are in a minute. You can also round out too high, which is as per this guy that ended up at 7 meters high and then he fell out of the sky. You can have big power changes late on, and that's typically when someone's realized something's not really working out very well for them, and then they add a blast of power right at the last minute. That creates problems, mainly in yaw change. And all of these 5 that we've just talked about tend to be linked. So basically, if you have a problem with one, you then tend to have another one of those problems, which is either magnified or is created. Cameron's asking me a question. Is trimming the aircraft in tandem machine more an issue? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Cameron's only ever flown single seaters, which tend not to have in-flight trim. Yeah, so basically, you tend to trim for an airspeed, Cameron. So with our 2-seat aircraft, because they've got a relatively quite a broad range of speeds. I mean, for example, I haven't got a picture of it actually. I have. I've got a picture of the Cavalon. Awesome. So Cavalon will fly straight and level, and if it's got a 915 engine as this one, you can fly a 915 Cavalon straight and level pretty easily at 30 miles per hour. But it'll also cruise up towards 120 miles an hour. So clearly, you know, the stick position to fly at 30 or the stick position to fly at 120 is going to be different. And all the trim system does in auto gyro products is it's a pneumatic system that just takes away some of the stick force, as most trimmers do, frankly. And so yeah, normally if you're flying around in a Cavalon, most people will cruise around in a Cavalon somewhere between 80 and 90 miles per hour, but they'll probably slow down to 60 to 70 in the landing phase. So they just need to retrim, really. So that's the situation. Another problem that we have with landings is that let me go chat. Yeah, cool. Another problem we have is people are very reluctant to go around, or they're not. They don't even think about going around. That's the problem. It's not part of their mental process. It's not part of their flight planning to incorporate a go around as an option for them. The other thing is bashing the circuit. That certainly tripped up that guy here in the Magni, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Crosswinds are another issue, which is also related to yaw and drift issues. And then I'm going to talk about these last three separately, which are questions about linked nose wheels, the aircraft that are side by side rather than tandem, and the managing of our rotors after we're on the deck. So we talked about this in reasonable depth anyway, which is this inconsistent approach. And this graphic is from, would you believe, some of you may not know the aircraft, but it was an aircraft called an Gyrocopter, which was around about probably almost 10 years ago now. And had a factory fire. It was an Austrian aircraft. It actually looked quite Gucci. It looked quite smart, flew quite quickly. And this was one of their graphics showing you the virtues of a gyroplane. And a lot of people typically actually in single seaters still kind of use this as a bit of a template for their landing. It's probably not quite as aggressive, but they're all, a lot of people like to use glide approaches all the time. So they'll arrive with engine on idle, and at some point they'll get to 60 miles an hour and then they'll try and make a landing. The problem is that, as you can see, once you're trying to get the aircraft from this vertical descent to an acceleration at 60, but 60 miles an hour on idle power, probably means that the pull to round out is quite an aggressive pull. And I'm just going to show you a little clip on YouTube, which will probably, let me get it up and we'll see what happens. Just find my, here we go. So I spoke about that German guy earlier, and I'm just going to tee up this video here. Get a big screen, stop sharing, share this screen with you. Okay, here we go. Oh, no, what's happened here? Stop sharing that screen. This one. on. Share that one. Right. Now you can see this, can't you? So let's get it into big, and you can still see all that. So this is, let me just get some sound on here. So this is this German pilot, and for some reason, he's previously flown all of his circuits to his home airfield with powered approaches. And now for some reason, he's gone to this airfield, which he's never been to before, and now he's going to make a kind of glide approach, and you'll see how right at the end, there's a massive blast of power and a bit of a yaw change, and he's, well, he gets away with it, but you can see how it could have gone badly wrong. Let's just watch the clip. So he's pulling the engine back to, idle. And the runway is here, by the way. So now if you look at the, let me just stop this actually. I don't know whether I can get, let me, it is on 720 apparently, I'm not entirely sure it is, but this is airspeed here. You can see at one point, now this guy to the right of him is the instructor. See how this pull to come level is a bit more aggressive? And there's the blast of power. And we kind of just dump it on the runway. And I think, if I'm honest with you, I think he was glad that all of that was over, really. And I show that just to give you an example of how, if you're not consistent in what you're doing, then you can never get used to that. And if we relate that back to what we were talking about earlier, where people are arriving at these scenarios with only 12 hours of instruction and 60 hours of total time, then the odds are you're not going to have had many opportunities to practice that new approach. And certainly, if you practiced on your own, but you're only a 12-hour or 20-hour or 30-hour pilot, well, who's critiquing who? You know, you're the, for want of a better word, you're the dummy trying to critique yourself, and you know there's a lot that can go wrong. So we need consistent approaches, and not all of the time do we get them. The other issue are the slow or glide approaches. Now, back in the old days, this is a graphic from 1967. It was actually published in the popular Rotorcraft Association's magazine of the period. And it shows, well, as you can read from the table, it's basically a table from the NTSB of gyroplane accidents. And if you look here, majority of the accidents are takeoff and landing, so nothing's changed in over 50 years as far as gyroplanes are concerned. But one of the things that possibly is even more consistent is that back in the day, you can see here, it says lost airspeed on downwind turn. Well, basically what was happening is because the instrumentation was fairly Spartan, obviously people were flying downwind, but because the wind's behind them, their ground speed was quite quick. So what they were doing is they were slowing down, trying to keep the speed, because they're looking out the window, or they're looking out at the world and their surroundings, seeing, you know, things going past quickly. And they're constantly trying to get slower to manage what they can see visually, rather than, you know, an airspeed as you'd read on the airspeed indicator. And then what would happen is, as they turn final, and then try and do a glide approach, clearly when you're going slowly but you've got power, the aircraft can maintain its height. Soon as you pull the power away, you're taking away the energy and you get the sink. And that's one of the problems, less actually in that term, because most airfields that we fly, or most circuits that we fly, or patterns that we fly in the US are more square rather than this curved, you know, downwind to final turn. And obviously the instrumentation has got more consistent. And we do talk about airspeed a lot more than perhaps they did in the 1960s. But nevertheless, one of the problems about getting slow and with the glide approach is that not only do you get a steeper approach that you've got to pull more aggressively to round out from, but also you tend just to get one bite of the cherry. You know, if you're on idle, people tend not to want to go around so much from these glide approaches. They just kind of persist with it and hope that it works. But of course, if you then pull too early and you've rounded out high, you effectively just fall out of the sky the last few meters or feet, or however accurate you happen to be. The other thing is that the way that you may catch it is by giving yourself a blast of power. But by giving yourself a blast of power, you obviously induce a lot of left yaw, which you need to track with the right pedal. Again, close to the ground, that's not ideal, especially if you're not an experienced pilot. So, you know, low time pilot, hasn't had much dual time, hasn't had much instruction, now tries to do or replicate what he's seen or what he's heard, makes a mistake, and then compounds his mistake with other mistakes. And then, of course, because you've got big yaw, then when it lands sideways and tends to topple over. The other problem with being very slow is that the tailplane is obviously an aerodynamic surface, so the tailplane, the vertical surfaces of the tailplane create much more stability the more airflow that you've got over those surfaces, and by definition, the slower you are, the less airflow you've got. So effectively the rudder just isn't working so well. And if I show you another film here from 143, let me just get that there. We'll see how that is. You will see some of these slow approaches that I'm talking about, which will help you visualize what I'm trying to talk about. So 143. Stop sharing this screen. And share this screen. Okay, you can see this screen. Get rid of the advert so we can see more of it and make it big. Right, hopefully you can see all of this. So, having flown a stable, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of the, I'll commentate it live. So what we were looking at here is someone's just been at a gyroplane flying and filmed all these landings. So that's convenient for us because we can see what's happening. So this guy is in a Calidus. Actually, I think this is quite a nice landing. This is a sort of landing. So let's just get back here, back him up a little bit. There we go. Right, so he's on final approach. I quite like this landing. So you just relatively flat. You can see that the round out, there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of pitch change with that round out. He's in the float, throttle will be closed, wheels on the deck, holds the nose off, and no drama at all. Same with this guy. See how he's starting to get slow, but he's got slow just as the things touch down. Kept the nose in the air. This guy, I think, has a little bit of yaw at touchdown, and I want you to watch how when it touches down, I think it touches down slightly on the right wheel first. It throws the aircraft forward onto the nose wheel. So here, look, he's starting to get slow, and then see how just if I try and back that up ever so slightly, there, see? So he's just got slow, and what's happened as he's got slow, I'm just trying to get the angle there. So this, as he's got slow, he's just started to get a bit of yaw, which has been left unchecked. The wheel's touched, and as it's touched, it's then had a secondary effect to throw him onto the nose wheel. Now, of course, what happens in this case, he gets away with it, but very often people don't get away all the time with that. Also, he's on grass, which is a much more forgiving surface, because obviously any inaccuracies in yaw, the aircraft will slip slightly. But you can see that's quite a big aggressive change, and also the nose wheel isn't exactly, you know, the thing to be taking all of the load. Now the next landing, he gets slow, and you'll see how easy it is to see how he started to flare, and he started to flare. You know, he's a good, what, I mean, I don't know, he's probably 10 feet in the air. Now he's persisted with the flare, and he'll fall out of the sky from about 2 feet. And you'll see even from 2 feet how, you know, it's not nice. Also to note, because he's in an auto gyro with this cranked keel, it's why you can get away with these big flares. See that there, look, I mean, back here, look, let's just try and back that up. I'll try and stop it. He develops the flare, look, see. He's developing the flare. Now he can get away with that with an auto gyro because of that cranked keel, which is, you know, now you can see that cranked part is almost perpendicular to the ground. But that, you know, has got all the makings. Well, there you go, perfect. So there you go, look, so the tail has touched. Obviously, if that was a Magni with a straight keel, you'd have buried the tail wheel basically into the earth. And then probably what that does is that when you've got a Magni, it creates now a pivot to the ground, and you know, you kind of fall off that pivot potentially. But that's pretty horrible. And that, see there, the nose just slaps down on the deck. So that's one of the consequences right there. Stop sharing, back to our PowerPoint. I'll get to the question in a minute. So that's one of the problems with just getting slow. And bear in mind, I would like to show these clips. I'm not trying to be smart and dig out the pilot. I'm just trying to show you that these things really happen. It's not a figment of my imagination or some construct to try and prove my argument. These things are really, really happening. Let me just get to the, there was something in the chat, wasn't there? Was there something in the chat? There's also a big crosswind. Yeah, kind of. I mean, let me go back to that actually, because I did want to finish that, because there was some other interesting. Yeah, where's the windsock? There's the windsock. Yeah, there is a bit of a crosswind. I mean, what's that? That's probably a 20 knot windsock. So there's probably a 15 knot crosswind. Yeah, maybe. You're probably right there. Actually, there is a bit of a crosswind. But don't forget, the good thing about a gyro and a crosswind is that the disc, a 28-foot diameter disc, has got a lot of control authority. Right, I think if I play this film on, yes, okay. This is the other problem of making glide approaches. There's our guy, bit of a drift. But actually, in fact, see that there, by the way, if you look at the windsock here, I'm pretty sure, sorry, I'm getting distracted, aren't I? If you look at the windsock on this orange one, I'm pretty sure the wind now is a lot more, seems almost on runway heading there actually. Anyway, doesn't matter. So these next clips are glide approaches from someone in the States. And what I want you to watch is watch the round out, which is the bit, for those who are not familiar with the terminology, the round out is the leveling off part from the initial approach. So, and watch how we end up ballooning. And then there's a secondary effect of yaw. So here you go, the glide approach, quite a steep dive at the runway, that pull, and see how the pull has then just become a bit too much, a bit aggressive, and now we've got this balloon, and now we're getting slow, and you've got to fix it, and in that case they got down. Here, look, see how there's the balloon again. Now we've got yaw. I mean, that's quite a significant yaw. And now we're just lingering at sort of, 18 inches above the runway. And thankfully there's an instructor in the back, because I think if that had been the student on his own, then, you can see how that could dig in and roll. The other thing that people like to see from videos are these big, landings that are very, very slow into a strong headwind. They obviously work out really well so long as the wind keeps blowing. Otherwise, maybe not so much. What happens with this guy? It's quite a nice landing, that. Here's one of those vertical descents. See how aggressive it is, nose down, and then at the bottom, quite a big pull, and you'll see how it bobbles. You've got always this yaw change at the bottom end of the round out. Right, I think we've covered that. Hopefully, have we? As you approach on an engine out idle approach, you get a rush of ground. Yeah, exactly. Yes, and that is, I agree. So what Cameron's saying is, if as you're on approach from idle, obviously as you get closer and closer to the ground, you get this ground rush effect, which, especially when you're a new pilot and you're not used to that, you then try and pull away with an aggressive round out, and that is the thing that tends to then balloon you back up. And of course, what tends to happen is all of the energy goes into the balloon, which gets you to about 10 feet. And then if you persist, you just fall out of the sky from 10 feet. And there's a lot of people have smashed gyroplanes up because of that. Right, circuit bashing. Let me show you what happens. Well, that's what happens when you bash the circuit in a gyroplane. This is the accident report. So that was a Magni M16. He was at Popham, so he was probably training with a guy called Steve Boxall. He was a student, 54, so he wasn't, he wasn't getting up in the night 50 times, was he? He was reasonably compos mentis. But he'd only done 22 hours, 2 hours in the last 28 days. So he wasn't the most experienced guy. And here you go, look, fourth solo. He'd done a couple of solo flights 15 days previously. On the day of the accident, he'd already done one solo flight, and then he'd had a break. And now he was doing some more circuits. And it was the third landing that was flat. And then he flared. Basically, it looks like once he was down, he then developed this aggressive flare. As I suggested, if you remember, I said if you're in a Magni, the tail will dig in, and then that creates a pivot, and you turn through 90 degrees and smash the thing up, which is exactly, if we go back to our PowerPoint presentation, what you see here, where the keel's bent. Look, you can see where it's dug in and bent all the keel, and then it's also damaged the rotors and all the control rods. So again, a real situation, That does happen. And that's just someone that's not particularly experienced, just getting tired. Typically, you'll see people that are getting a little bit jaded. Either they do multiple flights in the same day in a high workload environment like takeoffs and landings during this, around the circuit, and then it goes wrong. So if you're a student, if you're in that position and you feel tired, just stop and have a rest, or even just walk away and come back another day. Likewise, if you're a current pilot and you're trying to get back into the swing of things, then recognize that just plowing around the circuit, doing 5, 6 or more circuits, probably isn't going to be helpful. Limit it to 2 or 3, move on, do something else, and then do a couple of circuits at the end of the trip. Do a couple initially, fly off somewhere, and then do a couple at the end. You'll just be fresher. All that tends to happen if you do 6 or 7 circuits, for example, is that there'll be a couple of mistakes, and then you get frustrated and you're determined to make amends for it on the next one, and then you just make more mistakes, and then eventually your brains turn to mush and the thing's destroyed. Crosswind. Well, happily, I've made quite a good video on crosswind landings, and you should all probably take a look at it in your own leisure. But I just want to show you, I'll bring it up and I'll talk over the film that I'd already made, and we can see what happens. So let me just stop sharing this, go back to this. Right, here we go. So this is me actually at Western, sunny day. And one of the things you can see is, broadly speaking, we've got a crosswind that's coming from the left. And how do I know the crosswind is coming from the left? Well, my nose is pointed over to the left. The yaw string is broadly centered on the windscreen. So I'm in what we'd call balanced flight. And the runway you can see off to the right. Now, I can't land like that. I cannot touch down in this balanced flight state, because if I do, the right wheel is going to dig in, and then I'm going to roll over to the right. So I'm going to roll over towards this area if I was to land like this. So what I'm going to do is carry on a stable approach. And if you look at my airspeed, we could back this up quite a way actually, just to prove that I practice what I preach. And I suppose I should do, because this was a demo flight, but nevertheless. So what I want you to notice is the airspeed indicator, that's the highest quality. Notice the airspeed indicator, which is this here, and you'll see that it's broadly consistent. And this bit here is the trimmer, this top hat coolie. See how I'm trimming? Just constantly making sure that I'm balanced. I've got a light grip on the controls. I've not got a death grip. It's not going to kill me. You can be relaxed. So there's the aircraft. It's trimmed at about 70 miles an hour. Your string is balanced. The aircraft's trimmed. And now I've just got to make sure that there's nothing on the runway. My approach is stable, and then I can try and land. It's dead easy. I mean, so far, let's be honest, we've been watching that little bit of an approach for 10 seconds or so, and I haven't actually done very much. Now I'm down to 100 feet now. So I'm now going to start thinking about how I'm going to get this aircraft on that bit of tarmac. Because again, as I said a moment ago, I cannot land like that with the nose off to the left. Now, I always say the best way to do this effectively is lead with the pedals, so put the nose on the center line, so the nose is going to come to the right, so I've given it, in this instance, it would be right pedal. And then, if I did nothing other than put the nose of the aircraft on the center line, I would drift off to the right, because the wind would just blow me over to the right. So what I need to do is start with right pedal, put the nose on the center line, and then I introduce a little bit of left stick to keep the gyroplane positionally over the center line. So let's see how that works out. So in a minute, I'm going to put the nose on the center line. There you are. So the nose now is broadly on the center line. How do I know? Well, because look, there's the yaw string is now off to one side. And you can see that I've put a little bit of left stick. Now, these movements are subtle, because don't forget, with a 28-foot diameter disc or rotor disc, you've got enormous control authority. So you're never going to see 6 inches of deflection on the stick. It is relatively subtle. And there you go. It's probably on the deck actually. You see the stick, finger and thumb almost, it's not desperately gripping it. And I'm now just holding the nose off, holding the nose off, holding the nose off. And when we finally stop, you'll see they just retrim slightly, and we're still on the center line. So I'm going to get rid of that. You guys can watch that and listen to my chat during that video, which explains crosswind. But the key is, when we do crosswind landings, we really do focus on yaw and drift in the way that I described. But in actual fact, it's not really a unique technique, because if we just concentrate on yaw and drift during every landing, then we have just one technique to learn. It's not we learn a crosswind technique. Just think of the crosswind technique as an everyday technique, because it automatically means that we're focused on yaw and drift. I've got a question in the chat. Let me just look at it. Is there any benefit to a larger rotor? In that context, you'll just have more control authority, basically, Charlie. But of course, the other side of that is that, don't forget, if you've got the same weight aircraft, you'll have a lower disc loading, so probably means that the rotor RPM will be a bit slower. The only 30 feet, I don't know actually if they make 30 feet rotors for anything that's kind of contemporary. Maybe, I know the new auto gyros have got slightly larger rotors, but you know, like I think 6 inches, you know, so it might be 28 feet, 6 inches. So yeah, I don't know if it'd be a benefit. It would just be a function, if you know what I mean. I mean, as in, yeah, you've got more control authority because it's just a bigger thing. Okay. Why would you not set up your correction and drift further back on final? That's a good question, David. So David asked the question, why wouldn't you do the setup for yaw and drift earlier? Well, the reason is let me just take you back to the screen actually, and I will tell you. So, 2 things actually. The first is, when you're up here and you're coming down final approach, if you now start to cross what we call cross control, you've obviously just got an enormous amount of wind coming over the side and smashing you in the face at some point. So it's not the most comfortable state to be in, especially when you want to fly some distance at sort of, in this instance, I'm flying at 70 miles an hour. The other problem is is that the earlier people do it, their perspective of the runway is A, further away, and B, they tend to over control that cross controlling. So now if I put the nose on the runway up here, for example, you know, my vision of the center line is, I mean, it's not imperfect, but, well, sorry, it's not impossible, but it's not as perfect as it will be when I get a bit closer. The other thing is that it tends to be inexperienced pilots during this crosswind technique. They overdo the control, so they put too much pedal in and they put too much side stick. Now that's not easy to do so long as you lead with the pedal, because if you lead with the pedal, the reference is to the center line, and that is a definite, unambiguous feature. The problem is people don't tend to do that. Some people lead with the stick and then balance with the rudder, and then it can get massively over cross control, because you can roll and balance. If you think about it, you could put an enormous stick force and balance that with an enormous rudder force, and now what would happen is, instead of, if you imagine, you can see my gyroplane coming down final, instead of it just being slightly cross controlled, you know, you could almost be in knife edge with bigger and bigger inputs. So that's why I always say lead with the rudder and balance with the stick, so that you don't over control. And second of all, do it a little bit closer so that you've got a better visual perspective of what you're trying to balance to. Also, of course, it's very draggy. So the earlier, if you're doing it from up here, for example, you probably need a bit more power to drive it to the runway. So hopefully, does that answer your question? Stick it in the chat if you need to have a follow-on question from that. Right. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so that's crosswind. Now the next thing is linked nose wheel. Let's just cover that chat, make sure we're covered. Yeah, we're all covered. Perfect, perfect. So the next thing is linked nose wheels, which I said is a US thing. Now I don't mean that to be I don't mean that to be snobby or derogatory. What I mean is it's a US thing because in the UK we don't have any aircraft we can fly that have anything other than linked nose wheels. So it's not something that becomes a focus. I would say, again, I've done a video on this, which you can watch at your own leisure. One of the things that I feel, and I'll just show you the video so that you can see what I'm talking about. Hang on a minute, I'll just stick that in there, paste. No, I'm not showing the same thing. Sorry. That's what I wanted. Right, okay. Skip ads. Right, okay. So, let me just stop this. This is a sport copter. They do have this free castering nose wheel. And this is a demo to show you how effective this free castering nose wheel system is if you land a little bit skew-if. And as you can see, this is quite a ballsy maneuver, really. Now, I'll play it on in a minute. The point I'm trying to make is, obviously, if this is how bad your landings turn out to be, then you're gonna, you know, never mind the fact that the nose wheel makes your landings good or bad. At some point, you're just going to break the main undercarriage, or you know, you're just going to have a runway excursion because you're going to fire off the runway in some other direction. But I think you can see, look, it just touches down and flicks him the right way. But you can still see there's some secondary secondary effects there. So what do I think about it? Well, you can see my own view in the video that I made on the YouTube channel. But I've got to say, in truth, yeah, he is ballsy, that guy. Yeah, he does do rolls and stuff. I mean, I think he's a great, in fairness, actually, the guy's a talented, you know, he's clearly a talented pilot with a lot of faith in his aircraft. And the aircraft, actually, I think the sport copters are quite nicely made things, actually. The engineering on them is very good. But what I would say is there is a tendency, especially in the US, to overthink this because there are technological problems to overcome a problem which, for a lot of us, doesn't really exist. And why I say that is because if we go back to this film, which is a great illustration. Well, it's got to get this done. Sorry, I'll stop sharing. Come back to me. If we go back to this film, there we go. I keep saying the same thing now. Actually, I'm distracted by adding different things on the computer so I can share them with you. Here we go. Right, so back to this. So if you come back here and look at these landings that we had of our flying, the nose wheel's never on the ground. You know, look, this guy, this is quite a nice little landing with his wife or girlfriend, daughter. Look, see, main wheels are down, nose wheel held off, and the nose wheel doesn't need to touch the ground until, you know, it's come to a stop. This guy proves it absolutely. In fact, he almost holds off for too long and goes backwards. But look, the guy actually, look, it's stopped. So by the time the nose wheel actually touches down, you know, nothing's happening. You know, this is that guy with a bit of drift. But you know, look, even with a little bit of forward roll, you know, it's not firing off the side of the runway. So I do think that there is a tendency to overthink the linked nose wheel issue, because it's not, basically, if you fly correctly and you are making good landings, it's not an issue. The next myth is this side-by-side factor. So basically, there is a school of thought which says that it's more difficult to fly a Cavalon or a side-by-side aircraft like an M24 than it is to fly a tandem, because when you're approaching the runway, if I just get my orientation right, you are not on the center line. Your seating position is offset from the center line of the runway, creating some kind of parallax effect, and that's why people don't fly them so accurately. I don't buy a lot into that explanation. I think it's an excuse for other issues that are probably more to do with where people are looking and how people are flying final approaches. And it also creates extra revenue for the instructors that make a big deal out of it, because they're trying to get more hours out of you for doing for something that, you know, sitting side by side, it isn't a problem for people that fly fixed wing. It isn't a problem for people who fly helicopters. And actually, it's not a problem for any of us when we drive our cars, is it? We don't drive on the center line of the road in order to follow the center line of the road. We can quite easily follow the center line of the road, being sat offset from it. So if we can do it in a car, then I don't see why we've created some great illusion of how difficult it is in a gyroplane. But maybe, yeah, I mean, you know, maybe it does help a little bit of taxiing. Yeah. I just think it's just something that people, yeah, a little bit, Brian. Yeah, so basically, Brian's saying it. You know, in a crosswind, it's a bit of a, it can create a problem. But and maybe, yeah, but I think the point is that, you know, our brains and our vision are sophisticated enough to kind of allow for that. I think I don't necessarily think that we can't work that out. Oh no, sorry, you're talking about the link nose wheel. Yeah, link nose wheel and crosswind. Well, the point is, Brian. No, sorry, we're going back to link nose wheel. So I missed your question, Brian, when you asked it. I'm sorry. Right, I'll get these in order. So back to the link nose wheel in a crosswind. Not really, because in a crosswind, when you touch down, you're effectively touching down on one wheel, and then you can hold it off on one wheel and then put both down. The thing is, with the gyroplane, honestly, even if you're, so this is generally how I fly if I'm on my own flying for myself. I will, at Turwestern, if I'm flying for myself, I'll fly final approach, probably somewhere as high as 90 to 100 miles an hour, just because I want to get there. You know, I'm flying more quickly because I want to get to where I'm going. So I'll probably fly final approach somewhere 90 to 100 miles an hour. And because you know, I've got quite a bit of experience with these things, when I've got visually an impression of how far this aircraft is going to float once I close the throttle, I'll typically just close the throttle and float at 2 feet and land at the point that I'm going to vacate the runway. The one thing about gyroplanes is they're super draggy. So if you go back to now thinking about how I would teach a student, which is typically I'll fly a final approach at 70, we're flying powered approach 70. As soon as we round out, whether it's in a crosswind or with the wind on the nose, as soon as we round out, the airspeed's back to 50, 40 miles an hour real quick. And by the time we touch down, it's getting down towards 30 miles an hour. And to be honest, once we're on the deck at 30, you know, a little bit more backstick and we just hold it off. I think if you're having problems, helps taxiing after down when airspeed is low. Yeah, but what problem have you got, Brian? I don't understand. You know, because at the end of the day, if we're, you know, once we're landed and we've touched down with both wheels, we can hold the nose off for as long as we want. You know, the thing is that once we're down and we're just holding the nose off, like that guy was in his M16, you know, you can put the nose back on the ground, almost zero airspeed. It doesn't matter whether, doesn't really matter whether or not. Yes, I suppose with differential braking. Well, exactly. So with the free castering nose wheel, you've got differential brakes. So I guess it does allow you to turn quite tightly. Yeah, I grant you, I do. I mean, that's one thing with the link nose wheel. The turning circle is fairly terrible, actually. Yeah, I agree. James has put a Q&A talking about the side-by-side, about the issues, more of a factor of the length and the CG. Yeah, I think I mean, we're talking about Cavalon now, I guess, James. And yes, one of the problems with Cavalon is that, especially with low fuel or a lot of fuel, or one person or two people, the weight moves around the aircraft quite a lot, actually. So if you've got full fuel with a Cavalon and you're on your own versus no fuel, you'll tend to, when you take off, for example, need quite a lot more forward stick, which then on the other way, when you come to land, you need, you know, relatively a bigger rearward movement. Likewise, when you're flying solo or whether you're with a big passenger, as soon as you unstick, then that weight or balance is gonna change. Right. The other issue, of course, is after landing. So one of the things, again, I'm just going to show you a short film. A lot of people, when let me just find the little bit that I want there. All right, we'll go from there. Okay, share the screen. Yeah, a lot of people, when they come flying, is they forget that once the wheels are down, they forget in some ways that they've got a lot of energy still in the rotor. And so this is a guy in an M16. You can see here he's got 280 rotor RPM, and he's starting messing now down here with his stick retainer. And he's still got 240 rotor RPM. Now in the end, this is actually fairly benign and nothing comes of it, but it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to think that, you know, the process of doing this leaning forward when you've got reasonable energy in the rotor system, if you suddenly, you know, slip or move the stick in the wrong way, you've now just rolled the aircraft. The other thing here is this is actually, I think, at Oshkosh, and would you believe this is Chris Lord, I think, but see how as soon as he's down, he's now dealing with this is in an auto gyro, rotor brake and flight switch. He's straight away getting involved and straight away vacating the runway, again with huge rotor energy. And this guy, the rotor RPM is here. He's also just about to go for the flight brake knob. There you go, it's a common thing. And see, he's, look at this, we've still got almost flying speed in the rotors, and you know, he's maneuvering to backtrack. Now, my advice to you all is, if you're new to this and, you know, or you're not new and you don't have any time pressure, just come to a halt, let the rotors wind down a little bit, and then do the maneuvering. There's been an enormous amount of aircraft that have ended up being destroyed because they've been impatient, or they've been distracted, or they've started to maneuver before the energy has come out of the rotor system. As a default, you just want to keep the stick forward and central once you've landed, until the rotor RPM is down towards about 150, and then you can start deflecting the stick. Okay, any questions with any of that? No, I presume we've asked them as we've gone, haven't we? Cool. Okay. Airmanship. I'm just going to, one question, hang on. Yeah, there you go. So, so Ron's saying, you know, his friend was a low-time gyroplane pilot, and he lost control and he turned it over on the taxiway because he rolled over. Again, you know, that's just most probably rushing, I guess. And Ken saying, on some of the videos he's seen showing this steeper approach, gives you a little more insurance of making the field if you have any power issues. Maybe not shooting for the end of the runway, you know. Yeah, okay, right. Let's, okay, before I move on to airmanship then, I'll just answer Ken's point. So what Ken's saying is, a lot of people are making steeper approaches just in case they've got an engine problem, they end up making the airfield. It's a good question. It's a valid question. This is my view. First of all, I can tell you that in the UK, and this is genuinely, I'm saying this with all sincerity. The UK, in terms of its range of density altitudes, is relatively limited because we're broadly a sea level nation. There is a few hills in certain areas of the UK, notably Wales, the Peak District, Scotland, probably covers it well enough. The highest would be around, somewhere between 2.5 to 4,000 feet. But of course, we tend not to get particularly hot days like you would, like we're not like flying in the, in the mountains of Colorado, for example. So from that point of view, there is some ease, I suppose, for want of a better word, over the type of fuel. Because most of these engines, most of these Rotax 9 series engines, so that means 912, 914, and now 915, they all pretty much run on car fuel. Now, car fuel works fine at low altitudes. It's not so good up high. And when I say up high, I mean above, I think the recommendation is you need to keep things less than about 4,000 feet. The other thing is it doesn't like to get hot. So temperatures beyond sort of 30 degrees, you've got to be careful, which is why I think some of the people that have engine problems with Rotax in the US is a combination of either not thinking about the ethanol content, because I know that you guys have got E10, E15 and beyond ethanol content. In Europe and the UK, E5 is about as much as you see, actually. So that's, again, a safety factor for us. But there's either ethanol content in the fuel, which has an effect of height and temperature, and it also isn't great with the internals of the fuel system. So carburetor floats are one of the problems that you get if you have high ethanol content in the fuel. So that's why some guys in the States get Rotax. Yeah, exactly. and so that's a problem, Herb. And if that is the problem, you should run your Rotax on basic avgas, because whilst you will suffer a small penalty with additional engine kind of checks, you won't have a stoppage in the air. And I think I'd prefer to just check, get the engine overhauled more frequently than have a stoppage. You need to really, it's a serious issue, actually. Again, I've done a video on this kind of thing in the channel, and that gives a bit more colour. But you do need to pay attention to that, because that's why people have Rotax engines. So going back to the point I was about to make, in the UK, I know genuinely, since Rotax 9 have been fitted to gyroplanes, which is broadly 15 years ago, I know of about 2 Rotax problems in 15 years of over the whole of gyroplane flying. So the point is that engine stoppages now are a lot less common than they were in the older days, when people were using 2-stroke power or rebuilt Subaru automotive engines or rebuilt Volkswagen engines and so on. What's happening with engine failures are almost, don't get me wrong, and actually ironically, because we're talking about airmanship, it is something that you need or you should be able to do, and you should keep current and mindful. And obviously when you're flying cross country, you should always almost expect an engine failure so that you're looking for somewhere to put it down. But there comes a point where the risk of that practice outweighs the benefit. And for me, there are a number of issues with making every landing a glide approach, because as we already talked about, the round out is a lot more difficult. You've got a lot less airflow over the tail surfaces because you get slow. It is a slower approach. You approach much more slowly because typically the glide speed you'll use will be 60, which will be the best glide rate, rather than flying somewhere like 70 to 80, which is, you know, obviously with power, you can do that. And then finally, visually, if you're sharing your airfield with other traffic, you look very odd because you're up here and fixed wing traffic is down here, and you up here doing your glide approach, about to tip in. You to everybody else just look like, you know, you look like you're just going around. And don't forget, rules of the air, when the two aircraft are on final, the lower aircraft has got priority. So all you're encouraging is for this guy to come underneath, thinking he's got every right, and then you suddenly, you know, unsighted, dive on top of him. Now, I'm not saying that these things are commonplace, and typically, you know, gyroplanes tend to fly, you know, maybe different circuits even, but it does require awareness and cooperation. And certainly in the UK, gyroplanes wouldn't fly a different circuit than they would from fixed wing. And most of the people that fly other aircraft, i.e. helicopters and fixed wing, they very seldom see a gyroplane. So they're not, you know, they might even initially think it's just a helicopter. And when you're up here, you know, you're going to the helicopter pad, whereas actually you're going to land on the same bit of tarmac that this guy's in his aeroplane is going to land on. So I take the point, Ken, and it is a valid point, but my I guess my opposing view of that is, you know, you just got to be careful that what you're doing as on a daily basis to practice these glide approaches to be prepared for the time when the engine quits is, you know, the risk and the reward are not skewed the wrong way, I suppose. So thanks for that. Cheers, Ken. So back to airmanship. So the point about this is that it's a given that all the other things that we're just talking about technique here. It's a given that, you know, the runway is clear, that you've checked the circuit for traffic and you're not about to, you know, carve someone up in the circuit or get in someone's way, that you can do the radio, that the approaches are consistent, that you've trimmed, and you're not flying overly slow relative to other traffic in the circuit, i.e. you're fitting in well. All of that is a given. So when we talk about doing landings, it's not all about stick and rudder. There are other elements to this that you just need to make sure that you're on top of, so that, and we'll come on to it in a little while, you don't get mentally overloaded. So the techniques themselves. My view, and this is where if you've got any questions or anything that you are not necessarily sure of in your own technique or you want clarifying, now's a good time to stick it in the chat or the Q&A. So basically, all of our airmanship, all of our basics of airmanship have already been covered. We've trimmed, and we're going to fly a stable approach at an airspeed that fits in with the circuit that we're flying. Typically, in the average GA popular airfield, it will probably mean you flying around the circuit, i.e. downwind and base, somewhere around 80 miles an hour, and it will probably mean flying final approach at about 70 miles an hour. It needs to be stable. So when you're on final approach, as you could see in that Crosswind video, we've trimmed for our airspeed, a light touch on the control. We're not hand flying it, so we're not busy on the controls, and it's just coming down nicely. That gives us time to look out of the window, make sure our airfield is clear, that there's no one on the runway or about to enter the runway, and that we are going to land on it. The other thing you should be doing is that by the time you get to sort of 200 to 300 feet, make sure that all of these factors are valid, and if not, you're just going to go around. So the default is, if you're not stable and it doesn't look as if the runway is clear or you are going to get to the point that you've chosen as your approach point, you're just going to add power and go around and try again. Too many people persist with approaches that are either unstable in speed or unstable in pitch, or they're not really sure, you know, they're adding power, taking it away because they're not really sure where they're trying to get to, and they persist with that all the way to the bottom, and then it never gets any better, and then they have an accident. So if it's 200 to 300 feet and you're not stable and everything isn't as you would want it, just throw it away and go around. That will keep you the safest you could ever be. The next thing is, once you've got to that height and you have decided that you are continuing the approach to land, bear in mind you can still go around beyond that point, but you've already said if it's not before that point, you are going to go around. Now your focus shouldn't be on the instrument, so you shouldn't be looking at altimeter or airspeed. Once you're down at 200 feet, lift your head out of the window, and you, from now on, you are just looking out of the window at the runway, and you're going to try and aim to come level at about 2 feet off the runway. So whatever approach profile you've decided, whether it be a glide approach, a steep glide approach, or a more gentle powered approach, and it doesn't matter what speed you're flying, the idea is to convert that descent to come level via a round out, and you're trying to come level to at about 2 feet. Once you're at 2 feet, you obviously need to make sure that your yaw and drift are controlled, so i.e. the nose is on the center line and there is no residual drift, having put the nose on the center line. And now you just close the throttle and allow the aircraft to sink onto the runway, with you giving more and more backstick to try and keep it flying at 2 feet, and eventually it runs out of energy and you'll be on the runway with the main wheels. That is pretty much all there is to do with landing. There's no more than that. And if you do those things consistently, and for more color on that, there's the videos on the channel. You can email me and I'll explain more than that, you know, but there isn't really any more than that. You're just going to be speed stable and pitch stable on approach, come level to 2 feet, close the throttle and just hold it off, making sure that there is no yaw and no drift, and the aircraft will land when it wants to land. What you tend to find with people that get in trouble is, as we've already discovered and talked about, the big errors tend to be yaw and drift. Now, yaw in particular, an aircraft can actually fall out of the sky from a reasonable height, so long as the aircraft is pointing in the right direction, and you'll get away with it. But if you've got too much yaw, it doesn't, that is the thing that it will tolerate the least. Okay, any questions on that? Does the vertical descent approach possibly confuse other fixed wing? Yes, exactly. Yeah. We've talked about that. Exactly, Cameron. You're absolutely right. It does confuse them. If you do a vertical descent, they've got no idea. And you know, realistically, you'd need to announce that on any busy airfield. You'd need to call that. You'd probably have to call it that you were doing a practice emergency landing or something, because otherwise, you know, a fixed wing pilot wouldn't really know what a vertical descent was, to be honest with you. Okay, so happy with all that. So the last thing then is this concept of mental capacity, and it ties in well with airmanship. And the point is that very often, when you're a student especially, you're very keen to be good with the stick and the rudder. You know, you want to feel that you're good with your hands. You know, you've got good fundamental handling skills of the aircraft. And you'll spend as much time with enthusiasm to get that bit right. But where we're not so focused is on the things that also make us better pilots and better able to be good at the stick and rudder. And that are things that soak mental capacity. So be aware of your environment. I've talked about this before, and I'll just show you again for those that perhaps have not seen this. Let me stop this share. Okay, here we go. So this is the Cavalon Pilot Operating Handbook. And this is the number of panel layouts for Cavalon. So this is a dual screen Garmin with a hydraulically adjusted prop. This is what they call a standard panel. This is what they call a day VFR with an iPad. This is, well, this is a bit of a cobbled together picture of a day-night VFR screen. This is a glass cockpit single display, and this is a dual display. And if you watched my Cavalon film, this is also a Garmin G3X screen. If you watched the film that I gave on Cavalon, it's got this display, which is completely different because it's got this panel above the two screens, which doesn't appear in any of the other layouts. So goodness knows what the functionality, who knows what the functionality of that is. So now you might take my point that you could quite easily see a scenario where maybe you've done some instruction in a Cavalon, but it's not the Cavalon that you end up flying or you end up buying, and it's got a different layout. Unless you spend the time going through your own layout, when it comes to the point when you desperately need to know, you don't have time to learn, and you then make a mistake, or your mental capacity is so absorbed with that thing that every other element of your flying turns to shit, for want of a better word. And it's true, it happens. The other thing that tends to kill mental capacity is radio. Now, I'm going to show you, let me try and find, why can't I copy that actually? That's a blow. It's actually not a takeoff, but it's not a landing, it's a takeoff. And what I want to do is, let me just show you, that's me. Let me find, is it seed got? Right, here we go. So let me share my screen. Where am I? Right, here you go. So this was an accident that happened in the UK at Leicester. It's not far from, about an hour drive from where I live. It's a nice airfield, busy. GA airfield is Leicester. Now this guy is not, you know, he's not entirely a novice. He hasn't flown very recently, but he's got enough time to know what he's all about. But with all that said, look how easy this goes wrong for him. So he'd flown to Leicester and he taxied along 04 with the intention of stopping at the hold for 28. So you guys don't know Leicester, but I do. And if you imagine an old triangular type, there you go. So imagine, if you get an airfield plate, you know, the old wartime, you know, 3-runway airfield layout. Basically, what he's doing, he's trying to get to 28, right? It's because the screen inverts what I'm doing. But he's trying to get onto 28. He wants to take off that way. But to get there, he's had to drive around a triangle effectively to get to the hole for 28. That's how you do it at Leicester. But what he's done, look, is he's overshot. And now he feels that his rotor tips were a couple of meters away from the runway. So he's a little bit stressed. And he's contacting the tower. And then he's checked to see whether he can line up, but he can't because he can see an aircraft on final approach. But he's obviously stressed that he's got his rotors over the threshold. And now he thinks that the other pilot was going to do a touch and go. And the other pilot was giving this gyroplane pilot a bit of a beating him up on the radios, berating him for being in the active and saying that he has to go around again. So he basically decided he was going to try and line up and expedite his takeoff. But in the process, he basically screws up the takeoff and crashes. So the point is that obviously mentally, he's got distracted with so many things and felt pressured to do things. And then he's made, you know, he's compounded his stress by making further mistakes. And so, again, I'm just reiterating the point that not all of the techniques are the totality that makes you crash or not crash, or a good pilot or a better pilot. There are other elements in there that make the, you know, complete the picture. And that's why when I talked at the beginning of all of this, that said I don't think that, you know, 10, 20 hours is enough. It's not necessarily just because 10 or 20 hours solely focused on a takeoff or a landing technique isn't enough. It's just that I don't think that all of the parts put together, you've just got enough time to get everything done that makes a difference, and that's the key. So that's me done. So I'm not sure. Have we got? There we go. We might have some. We got some chat. What's happening? Yeah, cheers, Ken. Appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that. If you've got any questions for me, throw them in the chat or put them in the Q&A. Don't forget, yeah, thanks, David. Appreciate that. And the shortest, actually. But look, I'm always around anyway. So if there's anything you, yeah, I do actually. So I think the last webinar, someone wanted to know, what they asked me? There was a suggestion of something for a webinar, and for the life of me, I've forgotten what it was now. But if you've got any thoughts on what you'd like to talk about, then send me an email or let me know. Thanks, James. Yeah, if you've got any thoughts on what you want to talk about, then just let me know. What I'm also thinking of doing, which will be for free, although it won't be a presentation from me, what I'm thinking about, yeah, it could be about jump. It could be about jump takeoffs, David, but I'm not sure we could ever do that. That's for the helicopter session. Thanks, Cameron. Yeah, I think what I was thinking of doing is doing for free on YouTube, just like you know, half an hour Q&A, and we can just talk about anything gyroplane. So I'll just be there, and if there's no interaction, I probably won't say very much. And if there's questions, then you know I'll get involved. Otherwise, I think the next one. Yeah. Typically, there's more accidents on takeoff than there is on landing, but it's a close run thing. There's been a bit of a switch on that, Ronald, because in actual fact, the big issue on takeoffs used to be people setting off down the runway with the stick forward, and then they'd realise they've got the stick forward, and then they pull back and then crash. But just lately, there's been quite a few accidents where people they get slow for some reason and they just run out of runway. I mean, I've seen at least two. The Cavalon 635 Bravo Charlie, it wasn't exactly a landing accident, but it just got slow on a sightseeing trip. And then there was another one, an Auto Gyro Sport, that crashed just after takeoff. I'll have a look at that, David. In fact, bear with me and I'll get a thing. 1 second. Because, would you believe, I've got a chart that tells me, hang on. Bear with me, this sounds a bit flaky, it's a bit impromptu. Here we go. Let me just get that. Right, hang on a minute, I'll get you there. I'll be there in a minute, I'll be there in a minute. There you go. That's all the Cavalon accidents that have, can I make that bigger? There you go. There's all the Cavalon accidents worldwide, I believe. So in the US, the first one was this 470 Charlie Hotel. That was with an instructor, I believe. That was an instructor student flight. And they said they had an engine out after takeoff. And I'm pretty sure that was either the floats in the carburetor that had absorbed some stuff out of the fuel, or it was bad fuel and it was a hot day. And it just kind of got airborne, but only just, and then pancaked into a field. The next one was 477 Alpha Golf, landing and a tip over. Then we've got another pancake from 4 meters. So that's a landing accident. But in fairness, look, a 72-year-old student, and actually, you know, I've got to say, unfortunately, gyroplanes do tend to attract older people. And I'm 49, so it's not as if I'm a spring chicken. But the reality is that the older you get, in the end, you just get slower, and trying to learn new things when you're very old is obviously a bit. Yeah, I can see that the board's lit up. So pretty mixed bag really is the answer about takeoffs and landings. They're mainly takeoffs or landings actually. What are the ones I got? Yeah. Well, 470 crashed twice, Charlie, and very sadly, 477 Alpha Golf crashed 3 times, and I think the third time it was fatally. They're yet to find out what that was, but I mean, again, that was quite an old guy flying that, and I'm not convinced about the fuel actually. And I say that I'm not convinced about the fuel because if you read the preliminary report, the family really overplay the fact that they say it's non-ethanol fuel, and I just don't think that's a natural conversation to have with your mom and dad, or your family. Let's be honest, I go flying all the time, and I don't make a point of saying to my wife, I'm just going to the fuel station, sweetheart, to get non-ethanol fuel. And it wouldn't mean anything to her anyway. So I'm suspicious a little bit about that actually, but we'll see. We'll see what materializes. Right, gentlemen, if you've got any more for any more, thanks, Keith. Yes, I can. Sorry, Cameron. Mechanical turbulence near to, yes. So very quickly then, Cameron's asking me about the effects of turbulence near buildings and trees, and it's quite a big thing actually. So for example, Western actually has got, which is where my home airfield is, it's got a lot of trees down one side, and if you approach from the other way, you've got a big control tower and some sort of rolling landscaped bits of grass that stir the air up. Basically, just it acts very much as if you've got a lot of thermal activity and a lot of sort of localized crosswinds. And again, that isn't necessarily easy to deal with if you get slow. For me, the more turbulent or the bigger the crosswind, you want to get a little bit quicker. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, let's imagine that we're flying along at, let's say, 30 knots, and we've got a 10 knot crosswind. Obviously, our crosswind component is only 1/3 of our forward speed. But as we get slower and slower and slower, as soon as we get to 10 knots and we've got a 10 knot crosswind, now it's a much bigger deal. And obviously, if you back that up, if you're now doing 70 knots and you've got a 10 knot crosswind, then obviously it's less of an effect. So yeah, that's it is definitely something that you need to consider. And also, it's something that if you go back to the airmanship point, you can research that very much by looking at airfield plates, doing a low flyby so that you can see how the turbulence is, or just pick up the phone and speak to the guys that fly from that airfield and say, is there anything I need to consider when I come to land at your airfield? Okay, guys, thanks for watching. Thanks for being with me. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It seems that you all enjoyed it. And as soon as I get another one, I'll post it up, and we'll try and make it relevant. If you have any ideas, please do send me an email and give me some suggestions, because the more suggestions that you give me, the more I can write some useful material. Right, cheers guys, appreciate it. Take care, good night. Thanks. Bye.